It should be over the. Okay, I got it. Well, hey there, Becky. Thank you so much for joining me today for the Confident Sober Women podcast. I'm so excited to share you and your story with my audience. If you would share a little bit more about your story, and then we're going to chat.
Okay. First of all, I'm so happy to be here. Thank you. Thank you for having this podcast and thank you for having me on it. Little bit about my story. I'll tell you I'm almost 10 years sober and so damn grateful every day. My story kind of stretches back into the story of my father and his father before him. I come from a long line of high functioning alcoholics. And, like so many of us that do grow up in an alcoholic home, we might have the sense that I'm smarter, never going to happen to me. I've seen these mistakes and I'm going to avoid them in my own experience. And of course, I was fooling myself. So I'm somebody who started drinking pretty early in life. I remember my first drink as, I don't know, 12-year-old, 13-year-old, and it was ugly. And I just sort of took off from there, all, 14, 15, 16 years old, sometimes drinking. This one always, I don't have a lot of shame around drinking, but there's something about this that gives me just a little bit of, oh, that's so sad. And it's the idea of drinking in the morning before high school. And I think that's because I have kids now who are about that age, and the idea of them picking up the habit and doing what I did is just heartbreaking. But it was something that was so normal and natural in the home that I grew up in. It was, alcohol was absolutely ubiquitous. So it was something that my dad did every day, everywhere, all the time. It's sort of like the movie title, everything. What was it? Everything, everywhere, all at once. Yeah. Yeah. And so in my throughout my later teens and my 20s and my 30s, that's what it was like for me. Happy, have a drink. Sad, have a drink. Mad, and I was mad a lot, have several drinks. And fast forward, I was late to motherhood. My two little girls came into the picture when I was 33 and 35. And when they were just a few years old, I decided to jump off the stressful corporate ladder that I had been trying to climb for years. And I know for certain that the stress I encountered in my professional life absolutely contributed to how much I drank in my personal life. And I reached a point just with, that never ending stress and being on call and, always needing to be available and never doing it good enough. That a couple things happened. First was I went to a part-time schedule, and I thought that would help a lot until I recognized that what it looked like at the public relations firm where I worked part-time meant going, I don't know, 40, 45 hours a week and taking a nice 20% pay cut for the privilege. And I did that for a few years and nothing got better. It just got worse. The demands got worse. The pressure got more intense. And so finally I was like, that's it. I'm out with no plan B. And I surprised everybody and I surprised my colleagues by saying, I'm going to do something totally different. And so I left the public relations world and leaned into what I had been doing on the side for, I don't know, probably 10 years, which is teaching yoga. And I thought, yeah, I'll do a little PR, I'll teach a little yoga, I'll spend more time with my kids when they're little. And it ended up that I was teaching yoga like full time right out of the gate. And I had all of a sudden all this time with these, I mean, I guess they were toddlers at, 3 and 5, 4, and 3 and 5. And that was new to me because I was the kind of mom that was like, I was the first mom to drop them off at daycare at the YMCA, and I was the last mom to pick them up at night. And so that was a different kind of stressful element for me, managing littles. And yeah, I think that was really the height of mommy wine culture. And so here I was all of a sudden with everything that I had thought that I wanted, right? I wanted to be home, I wanted to work less, I wanted to teach yoga more, I wanted to be with my kids. And my drinking, which had already been, I mean, I think I'd tried for 10 years to quit. It just skyrocketed. And I found myself, after school play dates up at the elementary school playground. Nobody knew what was in my glass, but I can tell you it wasn't iced tea. And we'd get, the moms and the kids would get together after school, and we'd bring everybody would bring a bottle of wine, and I'd bring two. Like, this is my one to share, and this is my one for me. And my drinking just went off the rails. And when I realized this is it, I really have reached a place where I can't stand looking at myself in the mirror. I can't stand living the way that my dad did, that I swore I never would. I can't stand, I don't know if you ever encountered this, but longing for the effects of alcohol in a way that I didn't long to be present in my relationships. So I have, I get a little tender when I think about the times that I shooed my kids away so that I could be drinking. But when I knew that I had to quit, I was terrified, but I did it. And after several failed attempts at moderation, which I think is a 4-letter word, the time that I decided for good, this is it stuck. And it's been almost 10 years.
Wow. Thank you so much, Becky, for sharing that. I love hearing your journey, and it's different than mine. And I'm sure it's probably the same and different than some of our listeners, which is cool. And that's what makes the world go round, right? We all have our own story. I can totally relate to what you mentioned about being home with your littles. I got sober before I had children, but then quickly got pregnant and had 3 kids in 4 years. And then the third one came, we couldn't like afford the daycare, So I was home, which I did want to do, but it's a very different experience being a stay-at-home mom than it is being any kind of working mom, whatever working you're doing. And you're responsible for these people and their lives 24/7, like it is a big deal. It is very, very taxing and exhausting in a different kind of way. It's
Yeah.
not better or worse than working. It's not any of that. It's just different. Just like being a working mom is different.
Yeah.
And it is an adjustment if you're not used to it. And I can remember my sister and other people I know who had babies, and then they're like, yeah, we're definitely going back to work. Like there's a definite feeling of like, I don't want to do this for some people, and it's challenging. I'm thankful I got sober before the big mommy wine culture took off, or
Yeah.
otherwise I would have been right in there with everybody at the fire pits on the on the
Oh,
driveways.
for sure.
Yeah, I got sober before that all took off, which was great.
Yeah.
So once you got sober, what was it like for you after that first year? Because the first year of sobriety, I always kind of call early sobriety time is like we have special needs. It's like it's like its own entity, right?
Mm.
It's kind of like relearning all of the things. And there's tons of people that talk about this, women that you and I are both friends with, people that do work with people specifically in that area. And it has a lot of unique qualities, as does after we've been sober for about a year to many, many more years, right? And so it's a unique time after we get sober for about that year time, because things start to change.
Yeah.
We're as sober as we're ever going to be. We now have our full selves to deal with, right? You know, we have relationships that might need repair. We have parenting, we have work, we have feelings to manage that we've really never had to experience before.
Oh, the
Stressors,
feelings.
you know, loss, all of these things
Yeah.
that just come at us because that's what happens in life, you know. But when you are in active addiction, you can manage that a lot differently. So tell us a little bit more about what it was like for you kind of after that period of time.
Well, you say, well, two things. After that first year, I kind of feel like my first year was not a first year. I had a little bit of an extended first year, we'll call it. And I say that because in the beginning, I had no support. I knew one other person who wasn't drinking, and that was my then husband because I asked him to do it with me. And so he quit with me out of moral support, but he didn't have the same kind of addiction that I had. And so no program, no quitlet, no podcast, no nothing. And I holed up in my house. I kind of cut out almost all of my social activities because I couldn't bear to be around alcohol. And I just kind of stopped. And so I wasn't sober. You know, when you say we're sober as we're ever going to be, I mean, I know you're talking about abstinence there and that we're not putting anything in. Um, and yet we all know the long-term goal is emotional sobriety. I was not, I mean, I was so far from any kind of emotional sobriety in the beginning because I was just, I mean, it was a classic case of white knuckling. And what that left me with was a huge amount of rage. Rage that I had no outlet for, rage that I couldn't talk to a friend and say, is this normal? Like I had no soft landing. So it was about 18 months of being dry, but not sober, you know, abstinent, but not sober. And I had finally reached this point where the rage beneath the surface, it was just like always bubbling right underneath my skin. And I had this moment of, you know, literally shaking my fist up at the heavens. And I've never been um, I've been a spiritual person, but I haven't been a huge God person. But in that moment, like looking up and just saying, what the fuck do you want me to do? Like, I'll do anything, just make this stop. And a little voice was like, why don't you go to one of those 12-step meetings everybody talks about? And I was like, fine, I'll go. I'll go. Fine. I mean, I was just so pissy about the whole thing.
Mm-hmm.
And so I went that night to a 12-step meeting and I hated it. I mean, I absolutely hated it. And the one part of it that was appealing to me was the anonymity. And I will never forget, like, you know, walk into this meeting, it was a mixed meeting and everybody's coming up to me. They can tell, you know, they can tell that I was new, that I was brand new. And everybody wanted to give me a phone number and people wanted my phone number. And I was very like, no, like I was so used to being in my own little square that was this big. And then a woman said to me, like, standing outside after the meeting, oh my God, this is your first meeting too? I was like, yeah. And she's like, it's mine too. Do you have kids? And I was like, yeah. And she's like, where do they go to school? And I told her, and she's like, oh my God, that's where my kids go to school. What grade are they in? And I told her, and she's like, oh my God, my kid's in that grade. And I was like, no, I finally try to get some community, and it's another mom that I'm going to see on the playground. And I didn't understand the strength that could come from that, you know, the shared experience and how amazing it could have been if I had been open to discussing my journey.
Mm-hmm.
And instead, I remember walking away feeling very resistant, but I remembered that moment of what do you want me to do? And so the next morning I went back to a woman's meeting That's still my home group today. And so probably it was my first year in that setting that I would call almost my first year of sobriety, where things kind of started to settle down, the rage dissipated, and then I could get to the work of pursuing emotional sobriety, and I could manage, like you said, the big feelings, everything. It just felt so hot. All those big feelings, they felt so hot, like you can't even touch them. And then, after that first year, the work of just learning to let reality be reality, which is something I had been studying and practicing in my own yoga practice and through my teaching. I talked so much about acceptance and non-attachment and contentment. And the work of my, first, after that first year in program, was really learning to apply all of those principles to my sobriety. And that's when the peace came.
Yeah.
That's when I could exhale.
I love that. Thank you for sharing that part. And I love the distinction that you're making, because I know there are people that can relate to that. And I think what you were describing is sort of the difference between recovery and sobriety, right? Like we can be sober all day long, but being actually in recovery and a recovering person is quite different. That's what requires the work of building confidence and learning about how to manage emotions, managing your relationships, managing yourself. The 10 step in the 12 and 12 talks about restraint of tongue and pen, which is a big part of our journey. This is like sort of old school language, but it's extremely applicable. How many times do we want to just shout out on Facebook? I do. I resist it all the time because I want to just say the thing, and then I'm like, what am I doing this for? Am I trying to get attention, or do I just really want to be heard or seen? Like, is there a different way I could do this? And really taking the time to evaluate those things. But that comes with a lot of practice, and certainly beyond those earlier phases of recovery, we need to be taught these things. We need to be taught, and we need to practice them. And that comes with that support system that you're talking about, from whether it's 12 step or smart recovery or courses or, other programs, whatever it is. We all need a something, to do this
amen.
thing, to do it well.
One thing that I'll share that might run counter to the point that you were just making about restraint of tongue and pen. Like I remember the first time I read that and just going like, yeah, that's not me. Because as a writer, that's been a huge part of my sobriety, but not the real quick, not the angry barbs, not the attention seeking behavior, but the real thoughtful, honest, exploratory, like self-examining kind of reflection that comes with sobriety. And that, coupled with a willingness to talk about things publicly that a lot of people don't, is kind of what took my sobriety to the next level. And I'll give you an example. So I mentioned my ex-husband, such a generous, kind person who, when I said, I cannot do this by myself, can you please quit with me as support? And he said yes. I mean, that was one of the biggest gifts one person could give another. And taking alcohol out of the equation of our daily lives revealed some real cracks in the foundation of our relationship. And our marriage imploded. And that was something because in the beginning, I didn't have a program. I didn't have anything. There was nobody to tell me, yeah, that happens a lot in sobriety. It does, because you take off the glasses and you get to see things that you were blind to before. And so I mean, specifically what had happened was about a year. This will explain my rage. About exactly a year after I stopped drinking, um, my husband shared with me, I'm sorry, I don't love you. And I haven't for quite some time. And it was just a gut punch. I didn't see it coming. My whole world just blew up before my eyes. I had these two tiny people, girls that are at that point like 6 and 4. And I remember seething at him like, but I had children with you, and recognizing this would never be the same. I didn't understand at the time that it would be irreconcilable. So we did things like therapy, and we probably hung on for another 18 months after that. But the way I was able to process was, at that point, I had a blog, I had a Facebook page that I called You Are Not Stuck, which was all about empowerment and choice, mostly in a professional realm, drawing on the experience of having quit my job. But in that time, I told my husband, I really need to write about this. I need to put my thoughts down in a coherent way to process, and I need to share them, because in part, I don't have shame about this, but I need community. And it was like, I wanted to normalize somehow that, you guys, just because we stop drinking doesn't mean things are great. In fact, things can really,
Right.
shit can hit the fan.
Mm-hmm.
And God bless him, he gave me that permission to tell whatever story I needed to tell. And I would say, hey, I write a piece. Do you want to read this before I hit go? And nope, it's your story. And that was the piece that brought me more and more clarity, that helped me feel those big feelings and process them. So I think there was a built-in restraint of tongue and pen, and at the same time, being able to write and talk about what I was going through helped ease that pain so tremendously. So I'm grateful for the chance to have had somebody who was like, you're free to tell the story you need to tell. That's a pretty unusual gift.
Yeah, yeah, it is. And it is very special to have that, and very vulnerable. I actually have, thank you so much for sharing that experience. And I think the phrase restraining tongue and pen, and I don't want to use all of our time on this, but I think it's important. It doesn't mean we don't have a voice.
Right.
It's really about do no harm is how I take it. Like we are not to send off text messages without rereading it and like really thinking this through. Like, what is this for? Or write that Facebook post that blares out about some, you know, um, political issue that is, I don't know. It's really more of a, let's think this through and make sure that we're not doing more harm than good. And also, where is it coming from? What is our motive? We have to check our motives. I think that's what that's
Yeah.
a lot of that is about. And to your point, like I've had the same experience. I wrote a memoir as well last year or in 2021. And I didn't know that's what it was going to be. I just started writing. I heard a message from my higher power over and over that said, write your story. And I was like, whatever, I don't want to do that. And I kept hearing it. And I'm not a journaler or any of that. I don't care for journaling. I know you like it. You talk about it in your book, and lots of people do. That's not my thing. So I was like, whatever, I don't know what this is about, but I'm just going to follow directions. So I made that commitment to do that every day for 30 minutes. And then lo and behold, I had 4 months later, I had 40,000 words, and I just didn't know what that even was. But I didn't expect to be writing a memoir. I mean, I guess as I was doing it, I was like, wow, this sort of seems like a book. And so I started thinking about it. But it was very challenging to be that. No, I got sober in AA, but that was 21 years ago, right? And back then, people were not coming out like we are today. It was
Yep.
not the same. So it was I wasn't shameful. And my people in my world knew I was sober and what was going on, but people in general in the public were not outing themselves or writing books about being sober. So it was
Mhm.
very much more anonymous and private. And so that's kind of how I was raised up. And it was fine. I was fine with it. But then everyone else started doing it. And I was like, wait a second, these women are sharing their stories in a way that's really vulnerable, but also really heartfelt and helpful, to me. I was reading them and I'm like, wow, this is really helpful to me. I have these same feelings. And so when I was doing it, similar to maybe your experience, I mean, I legit told my whole story, but my focus was much more on life and recovery versus, like, I had to qualify myself a little bit and tell some of the stuff, but much more of it was about living life in recovery, which, by the way, you mentioned already, is not all sunshine and roses. And that's why I wanted to do it. And that's why I shared a lot of things in meetings, even about the struggles, about having a sober bottom at 4 years sober, like wanting to die, like no one talked about that stuff. So I didn't even know that was possible. And so when I did that, I had the same experience, but I was literally telling 4 other people's parts of my story.
Yeah.
And it was extremely raw and real and like very personal. And so as I was doing that, I wanted to share my story. And I was told by my editor, thankfully, she said, remember, this is your story. And yes, it involves other people. You don't really need their permission.
Yeah.
And although I did kind of get it, because I was still, these are my children, my husband, but I didn't ever do anything out of malice or with an intent to harm. It was really my feelings about the situation, how I dealt with it and what went on. And so to me, that's a lot different than what we're called to do and be when we don't blast out things. When we take a minute and we refrain, reflect, and then respond, right? Those are the 3 R's that I was taught before we shout out to our spouse or our husband or our coworkers, right? We just give ourselves a second and think it through.
Yeah. I think the question you asked, like, what is this for?
Yes.
There couldn't be a simpler and more powerful question to ask and answer. What is this for? Why?
And I have a deep need to be heard and understood. I mean, that was a bigger problem for me in my younger years. I'm coming much more in terms with it in my older, much more content, peaceful self. But wanting to be heard and understood has been a big part of my entire life, as somebody who just never really felt that way. And so having a Facebook page where I could just say what I wanted to say feels really empowering. Right. And so I have done that in the past. There's been times when it's been really positive. There's been a few times when it was like maybe you should take that down. And I've had to do that too. And so there's this line, right? And I think that comes with emotional maturity that we gain when we stay sober long enough to do what we're talking about. When we stay sober long enough for someone to help us hold our hand while we learn how to manage difficult emotions, while we understand that everything isn't about us. That the world actually doesn't revolve around us, but this is a self-centered disease and human beings are naturally self-centered as well. So then you combine the two and you've just got this whole ball of like hot mess, and it needs to be managed. We have to learn how to manage that. And one of the things that you talk about in your book is how you learned how to manage that is through yoga. And it became a central focus in your life, really, truly. And I'm going to let you share about it, but when I was reading it, I thought, wow, this makes so much sense. And I really loved how you even shared at one point that you learned that you could do it anywhere. You could do it in your desk at your work or in the park or in a hotel room, and it's free and available to us, anytime. So, and even if yoga isn't your thing, for all of my ladies, it took me a long time to embrace yoga as well. But even if it's not your thing, you can relate to the concept, and I think I would love to hear you share a little bit more about that journey for you, and then kind of how it evolved into some real practical tools that you use on the daily.
Okay. Interesting. You say, ladies who aren't into yoga, and maybe this is me just being like, oh, but if you only knew what it was, you'd be into yoga. Come on, everybody. It's that. I mean, I really do feel sometimes like a little bit of an evangelist. The yoga that I first envisioned when I first even kind of eyeballed the practice is not the yoga that I know now. And I think for all those people like, oh God, yoga, it's a cult. It's
Yeah.
you have to be 19 in Lululemon leggings. It's like, I just want to debunk that myth that like yoga is not standing on your head at sunset on a beach for Instagram. Yoga is a practice of paying attention. And I know so many people are intimidated by the physical practice of yoga, right? The asana practice, which is what we do on a mat. That is just one part of the whole thing. And I won't bore everybody with a full explanation, but I'll give you a real condensed version just so you can understand the context that I'm talking about. Yoga is, they talk about the 8-limbed path of yoga, and it has to do, the first couple limbs are, you can think of them as like the 10 commandments, like how do you treat yourself and how do you treat others in society. So those are the first two, and then the last couple are all about connecting with connecting with consciousness and divinity, and the bliss of that union. And for some people that seems like, oh wow, that's way far away, like tell me what I can do today. The middle, the middle few of those 8 limbs are all about, and this is where you get like body, mind, spirit. That's where that comes from. It's a progression from, you learn to control your body so that you can control your breath, and you learn to control your breath so that you can control your mind. So even though, somebody says yoga and you're thinking tree pose, when I hear yoga, I'm thinking mindfulness and meditation. And maybe that's because I've been practicing it for close to 25 years. But the reality is like we do in limb 3, which is the asana practice, we do things like open up the hip joints and lengthen the spine and strengthen the core, all so that we can sit in lotus pose under a tree with our eyes closed for hours, right? But like that's the purpose of opening up the body. And we do that so that we can sit and we can breathe. And sometimes it's just a very gentle in and out. Sometimes we play around with the exhale. Sometimes we play around with the inhale. Sometimes we count or we chop up the breath. There are lots of different breathing patterns that are designed to do different things. And then the not the last piece, but the last of the 3 pieces is really getting into that turning down the volume on your external senses, like the noise or the discomfort in my hips, or the thoughts that are running through about all the 20 things I need to do today, and just turning all of that attention inward. And with a stable body, with a deep, repetitive, present breath, those thoughts can go from to like just that sacred coming home to yourself, and that self that is connected to everything else. So I think of like self with a capital S. I also call it stardust a lot. So when I think of that, connecting with that, like that's the place that I want to live from. I want to live from my stardust self, like my divine self, and not my frantic, ego-driven, self-centered, materialistic, narrow-minded self with a lowercase s, if that makes sense. So, for me, when I teach yoga, oh my God, my yoga practice has changed so much over the last 20 years. What used to be like this strong, rigorous practice is now like rolling around on the floor on my back and it's middle-aged woman yoga now. And it's just designed to feel good and feel at peace so that we can turn down the noise and tune in to this higher self. And that, I mean, in a lot of ways, that's what recovery asks us to do, right? When we talk about in 12 step, we talk about the promises, like self-seeking will slip away. We'll become concerned with our fellows. And by our fellows, we don't just mean the people in our family or the people in the room, but like the cosmic fellowship. And I know that might sound a little too woo-woo. Like learning how to handle things that used to baffle us, like when we learn to operate from that seat of self that has so much clarity and has so much peace and expansion, like we're a different person when we operate from that place. And so that's why yoga is so transformative for me. I mean, when I think of my sobriety, I lean on, like, I've got a 3-legged stool. It's yoga, it's therapy, and it's recovery. And what is so amazing is when, I'll get a bit of wisdom from one area and then it gets reinforced. I hear something in a meeting, and then 2 weeks later I talk about it in therapy, and then a month later, it comes up again in my yoga practice, and it's like, somebody's talking to me and I'm listening. And so, you asked about practical tools. The best one I have to share is the one that I come back to every day, which is just my breath. Mm-hmm. And, you don't have to have sorry, that's my doggo. You don't have to have like a fancy cushion to sit on. You want me to pause this while she's barking? I think the Amazon fairy is here.
Yes,
I'll mute it. I'll mute it and let you talk for a second, and then I'll come back to breath.
Thank you so much for sharing that about all the different parts of the yoga. Personally, I love the way you broke that down. And I think as a person who has kind of eased my way into kind of even the idea and then practicing a type of yoga in a very elementary way, I love and appreciate the middle-aged woman form of yoga. That's where I am as well. I'm not trying to do handstands. I'm perfectly comfortable, but I love the way it makes me feel when I get a good stretch and when I am quiet. I like to go to a studio sometimes too, but I also do it in my closet in my bedroom. That's the only place we have carpet in our house, and it's just a nice quiet space. But we don't, in our society, I think, allow a lot of space for quiet. I mean, there's just not a lot of emphasis on that in our daily lives. And so when we can make that a part of our practice as human beings living, we would be amazed at what we would receive in return for that, whether it's clarity on a certain problem we're having, or directions towards a goal we want to pursue. I mean, there are things that come to us in those quiet moments that if we would practice that very regularly and create space for it, we would be living at such a higher frequency, because when we tapped into that energy, we would be running down the roadmap that we're literally creating for ourselves. So I really appreciate that that concept and focus from you. And I also really appreciate your time and energy here today. I love the work that you're doing in your book. You Are Not Stuck is great. I just read it myself. It's a wonderful opportunity to hear a little bit more about you and your journey, but more so about the actual things that you do today and that you teach other people how to do, to kind of find that connection to self and also to something outside of self, if that's your thing. And I love it so much. So I really appreciate your time and your experience. And thank you so much for being here.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. I'll see you soon.
Yeah, you too.